Hello, everybody. Thanks so much for having me out here. I get to talk about what is my lifelong passion, freedom of speech. I was the weird law school student who went to law school specifically to do First Amendment law. I took every class that they offered in First Amendment, and then when I ran out, I did 6 credits on censorship during the Tudor dynasty. As an independent study. You found what you really want to do is when I told my friends, I'm doing 6 credits on censorship during the Tudor dynasty. And one of my friends was like, who's making you do that? And I was like, I made it up myself. This was always what I wanted to do. So I want to give you guys a little bit of an inside look about what the actual situation is on the ground for free speech on campus. It's kind of a hot topic at the moment. It's been for a couple of years now. But a lot of the cases that I see don't really look like sort of the stereotypes of what you might hear or think about free speech on campus. A lot of it usually follows sort of like a stereotype of it's basically just a right versus left problem involving, depending if you see it from one point of view, it's, conservatives saying awful things and getting in trouble, or conservatives saying, things that are just conservative and getting in trouble. And while those cases do exist, a lot of the cases I deal with on campus really don't. So what I'm going to talk about are the major trends I've seen in my career, and tell you some of the stories of what I deal with, and then get a little bit more into the book that I wrote with Jonathan Haidt. So here, so the first factor, I'm going to talk about, I think, 6 different factors, 6 different phases, and 6 different sort of like trends or that people point to. And probably the most common stereotype of what's going on campus is just political correctness. At this point, kind of an old-fashioned term. It's not even a term that people really agree on what it means. I think it's of, somewhat minimal use at this point. But it still conveys some of the cases you would see. But even the ones that I would say sort of involve political correctness don't always look like the sort of oversimplified stereotype of what the free speech situation on campus is like and what will actually get you in trouble. So this is a quick sort of overview of many of the cases I've seen in a single slide. The person in the corner right there, Chris Lee at the top, he did a comedy musical called The Passion of the Musical. It was a parody of The Passion of the Christ as a comedy musical at University of Washington. And he got in trouble with his administration for some of the songs. He was trying to do a sort of like South Park the musical type thing. And he was told by the police there that if they went ahead with some of the more offensive songs, that the police would not protect them from the angry crowd. We found out later that this was with some involvement of the university, just awful case. Then you have directly next to him, this is a more recent case involving Zach Wood, and that's him with hugging Cornel West. He wanted to invite to Williams College for a series called Uncomfortable Learning, a guy named John Derbyshire, who was fired from the National Review magazine because he'd written some flat out racist stuff. And what was interesting here is Zach wanted to invite Derbyshire, who's written books on mathematics, actually prior to that being fired was pretty well known, but he wanted to have him on campus to debate him. And Zach was overruled by the president of Williams that he was not allowed to bring this guy, even if he just wanted to debate him, to take him on in sort of like the best traditions of debate and discussion. Underneath that is Isaac Smith. He was the head of a project called Students Defending Students. It's a project where students who are getting in trouble by the administration, whether it's from academic issues or disciplinary issues, they get almost like a public defender among the students who will actually go and help them out and try to keep them from not getting kicked out in a lot of different cases. But membership at Ohio University had been going down, so they went back to the old slogan that they had back in the 1970s, which was student defenders, we get you off for free. Designed to be intentionally provocative, and nonetheless, they were told that they couldn't have the slogan, the t-shirts were banned, and it ended up being actually a successful court challenge. It went all the way up to the circuit court. And the one on the bottom are the students are on the side, the student editors. This is a picture from, this is actually a movie way before your time. Have any of you heard of a movie called Patch Adams? Raise your hand if you have. Some of you, okay, good. So basically like a PG-13 at worst kind of movie, but this is a joke about when at medical school they were, this is the gynecological department, and they put up a big balloon of someone in stirrups. Now they showed this picture from a movie, like I said, a PG-13 at worst movie, in a comedy issue of the student newspaper, and this newspaper was investigated for nearly a year for violating federal law. You don't have to be a First Amendment lawyer to know that this is, whether you find it offensive or not, this is not exactly at the edges of protected speech. So political correctness is definitely part of the equation, but it's not as big a part as people think. What's more common that we run into a lot, and I've worked a lot with, I think I first met John Lowry at meetings of administrators where I'm trying to explain, like, listen, you should know what you can and can't do, and I'm about to get a list of things that you should probably be really self-conscious if you're trying to do. So most of the cases I've seen for most of my career involve abuses by administrators. And this is where administrators tell students that they have fewer rights than they actually do. This is a case back in 2013 where a student who was trying to hand out copies, actual pamphlets of the Constitution on a campus in California, was told not only was he not allowed to hand out copies of the Constitution, but he had to get permission from an administrator, and he was smart enough to actually have his friend videotape it as this is all going on, and he was there probably handing these things out for 10 minutes. Now, what's funny about it is, this was Constitution Day, September 17th, 2013. So he's handing out constitutions on Constitution Day to honor the Constitution, and within 10 minutes, someone comes up and says, the guy in the middle saying, oh, you can't do that on campus yet, and he gives up, all of these different reasons why he can't do it, and he's literally standing there gobsmacked going, I'm holding the First Amendment in my hands right now. But amazing, and the final slide is him going to an administrator, because he's basically like a really nice kid, and he was kind of like amazed that they actually decided to die on this hill, so to speak. And that's the administrator there is actually going through her folder to try to see if the free speech zone, the tiny area that they had designated for free speech activities, was available that day, and it wasn't, so maybe he could celebrate Constitution Day in October? Not okay. This resulted in a lawsuit as well that we ended up settling. But again, this isn't exactly rocket science, and it's most of what I end up doing on campus. So when I talk about speech codes, more or less what I'm talking about are vague and broad bans on what you're allowed to say, or things like speech zones, where they tell you, you only have a 20-foot wide gazebo where you can express, we can hand out flyers or hand out petitions, and that's a real case. That's Texas Tech University. But for example, harsh text messages or emails are an example of a speech code currently enforced at University of West Alabama. Now, that's the definition of vagueness and breadth. Harsh is not clear, and basically anybody in this room can be found guilty of at some point in your life sending a harsh text or email. You're not allowed to have codes like that at a public university. That would be laughed out of court. And then of course the classic, the use of derogatory names, inconsiderate jokes, or inappropriately directed laughter, which we actually had to defeat twice. This was originally a policy at University of Connecticut, which got laughed out of court back in 1990 in an unpublished opinion, and then amazingly popped back up at Drexel University in Philadelphia. And we were gobsmacked by this one because it was verbatim from the code that was struck down in 1990. And I had to wonder, it's like, did you Google most ridiculously unconstitutional code that ever was and just cut and paste it and put it into your policies? So if it's vague and broad, so much so that you'd have to guess, you'd have to ask yourself, am I even allowed to say this under this code? Chances are it's unconstitutional. Now, quick review. Public schools bound by the First Amendment directly, kind of directly, but they're bound by the norms of the First Amendment. Private schools are not, except in the state of California, where they're bound through the Leonard Law, which actually applies First Amendment protections to non-sectarian private schools. But in general, private schools are bound by their promises of freedom of speech, and that's the standard that we hold them to. If you tell students when they join a private school that you got no free speech here, you can do that. But if you promise them free speech, our position is you should deliver. So just more examples of free speech zones. This has been, we've seen this time and time again. This is let's see if I get the, oh no, oh, look what I did. What have I done? Okay, never mind. That's what I was trying to do. Okay, that's the gazebo I was talking about. That's the sad little free speech gazebo. This is a school that has 28,000 students in it. I don't think they're gonna fit in there. If God forbid they wanted to exercise their free speech rights all at once. I did actually have a friend of mine who has a math degree from MIT do the dimensional analysis, and if all 28,000 students wanted to express themselves at the same time, he worked out that you'd have to crush them down to the density of uranium-238, which, this one is University of Cincinnati that we fought back in 2012. That was essentially laughed out of court. This is where students were trying to petition the government for redress of grievances, and they were told that they had to, they couldn't do it without 2 weeks advance notice and then use the free speech zone. The court didn't like that. This is the famous free speech swamp at University of Hawaii that I literally did not go down into because I was afraid I'd be electrocuted. It's just a swamp with a bunch of electrical equipment down there far away from everybody. This is another case where people wanted to protest the NSA or at one time, and another case, hand out copies of the Constitution. This happened all over the country, by the way, at different times, and it's funny because people were like, you set up these students trying to hand out constitutions, and my response is, I wish we did. Because if your university is so far gone that they actually think, oh my God, they're handing out constitutions, we have to stop them, that's entirely on them. But amazingly, all of these constitution protests were completely spontaneous. And I like to include this one here, Blinn College in Texas, just because it's the saddest little speech zone I've ever seen. The speech zone is just the two little blocks on either side of that sad-looking bulletin board. That's the entire free speech area for Blinn College in Texas. So this, like I said, this shouldn't really be rocket science. And the good news here is that we're winning. And we've been winning for some time. Because even though there's been a lot more attention to free speech on campus in the past couple of years, we've also made an awful lot of progress. And the way we rate schools is red, yellow, green. Red means laughably unconstitutional, yellow means meh, and green means great. We have no issue with your policy whatsoever. And as you can see, back in 2007, about 75% of the schools that we rated were red. Since then, due to 70 plus lawsuits and a lot of speech codes of the month, we're down actually now below 30% for red lights. Still, the yellow lights have increased. Still, that's I believe IUP, UIP is a yellow light school, but that's good progress. And we have a lot more green light schools as well. As you can see, that's increased a lot, which is great. And then you have the cases that don't really fit anybody's stereotype at all, that really I try to mention these cases every time I'm around, because there are a lot of cases that because they don't fit either a right or left narrative about what free speech cases on campus are supposed to look like, nobody pays attention to them, even when they're horrifying. And this is a case at Northern Michigan University where they had a policy that came as a surprise to some students. A student showed up, she'd been sexually assaulted. She went to talk to a counselor at their psychological services center, and she was told, and she thought everything was fine. She gets back from that appointment, and she gets a scary letter from the dean saying, we heard that you went to the counseling center. By the way, if you mention thoughts of self-harm to any of your friends, you will be disciplined. Now, think about that. Now, first of all, she was like, I didn't say anything. I wasn't suicidal when I went there. I didn't say anything about that. First of all, it's creepy that the dean knows that I went there to begin with. But second of all, are you really, if this is going to other students who might be depressed or anxious or suicidal, you're actually telling them, by the way, don't tell your friends, isolate yourself, and by the way, you're a burden on your friends. That's insane. That's a formula for actually having more people commit suicide than fewer. And this policy, I think it came from a misunderstanding of some psychology that I won't bore you about suicide clusters, but there is absolutely no evidence at all that simply talking about suicide can actually lead to more incidents of suicide. I think it's probably a safe bet that talking about it is a sign that someone actually wants to live. So these ones don't get national attention in the way that some of these, more famous cases do. Another factor that I've run into a lot has been federal overreach, and this comes from policies issued by the federal government that violate students' free speech rights. This is. Does anybody here know about the Laura Kipnis case? A couple of you. Okay, I'm glad that some of you do. Now, this case is kind of remarkable. This is a case where a feminist professor, Laura Kipnis, wrote an article talking about how, in her opinion, Title IX, the Anti-Discrimination Against Women title, has actually been interpreted too aggressively, and it's actually paternalistic for women, and that it's actually kind of insulting to their autonomy and all this kind of stuff. She mentioned a lawsuit against Northwestern. She didn't actually mention anybody involved in it, but said that this was, and she was partially being critical of the blanket ban on students and professors dating. And she had no issue with someone in someone's class dating, but she said this was a normal part of higher education for a long time, and to tell women that they can't actually date their professors is kind of, she thought it was paternalizing. So after writing this article, she was brought up on charges of violating Title IX by her school. So full picture, she was talking about restrictions on free speech, but over aggressively application of Title IX, and then she's investigated for violating Title IX for complaining about Title IX being overly aggressive. So she's put in a situation where she doesn't know who's charging her, she doesn't know what the charges are, she doesn't know, she's not allowed to have a lawyer, she's not allowed to talk about it in public. She goes through this for about 72 days and then gets fed up, and she's like, listen, I'm going to violate everything you're telling me to do, and I'm taking this public. So she wrote about it again at the Chronicle of Higher Education, and unsurprisingly, certainly from my experience, she the Northwestern dropped the investigation the very next day. Now, there's a little codicil on the back of this, is she then wrote a book about it called Unwanted Advances, in which she's talking about her experience being investigated for Title IX for complaining about Title IX, and then she wrote this book about this, and she was again investigated for violating Title IX by her school. After multiple multiple backing down by different aspects of the university, she still has one defamation lawsuit pending against her, but overall it just ends up being this like weird, infinitely recursive situation that she has. This is a case at Louisiana State University, and it shouldn't surprise you that in a lot of cases, these are professors, Title IX was passed ostensibly to help women and discrimination against women, which makes it all the more ironic that we see an awful lot of cases where it's women, oftentimes feminist women, getting in trouble for what they say. This is a case of a professor who was nominally fired for using rude and coarse language in her class. Which you could actually, if her colleagues decided that she wasn't living up to pedagogical standards, they could actually eliminate her. But here they were claiming that they had to fire her because the Department of Education's so-called blueprint for sexual harassment. This is, so far we've actually lost on this case 2 different times, whereas I think of this as a very easy First Amendment case if you can actually get to the merits on this. One of the areas that gets a lot of attention is the professorate. That essentially, a lot of people think that what's really going on here are sort of like professors run amok. And I do always want to bow to the fact that when there are stereotypes like this, there are usually some examples that back this up. And this is a much older case at Northern Kentucky University where a professor was on campus and she was angry that there was a pro-life protest on her campus, and it was a bunch of little crosses to protest Roe v. Wade. Now, this is actually a pretty common protest all across the country on the anniversary of Roe v. Wade. I live near the Capitol in Washington, and that's kind of everywhere. But she said that she didn't like the protest, and she went and told her class, it's like, and she told them, I want to exercise our First Amendment rights to destroy that display. Now, you don't have a First Amendment right to not be offended, you don't have a First Amendment right to destroy someone's property, but nonetheless, she took, this is actually actual pictures of her destroying the Christian students' the display back in 2006. And after being interviewed, I really got the impression she really believed that she had a First Amendment right not to see this. She stuck with that argument. She was fired for this, so it wasn't as if there was no consequence. But it really did represent to me a very sort of warped reading of the First Amendment that's not based in law at all. And then there are just classic cases like Chicago State University. This is a case where professors, and this was recently settled, and it was over the course of years. These were professors who were complaining about Chicago State University being, in their opinion, poorly run, corrupt, not managing its money well. And the university tried all sorts of things to get this professor blog shut down. And one of the first things they tried was to claim that using any pictures of Chicago State University was something they couldn't actually do because that was trademark protected. Not a good argument. The next thing they tried to do was claim that the professors who were writing this critical blog were cyberbullying the president of Chicago State University, a policy, nominally for the most part devised to protect children, should not be used to protect the president of a state university system. The most outrageous thing that they tried was, and this was something that was affidavit filed by one of the professors who was caught up in this, and one of the administrators filed her own lawsuit. Apparently Chicago State University approached two different professors to ask them to file false harassment charges against these professors. And to the credit of both of these, of this one administrator and these professors, one was willing to quit over this. She was like, no, I'm not going to be part of this. And the other one ended up getting fired and had to file her own lawsuit. And this case to me is absolutely spectacular, like in the neutral way. Like it's nuts, and it's got all sorts of crazy elements. It's in a major city. It involves corruption. There's nothing about political correctness in it at all. And it tends to get ignored by the media, which I think is kind of crazy. This is exactly what free speech was, designed to protect, is your ability to criticize people in power and institutions when you think they're doing wrong. But this has barely generated any media at all over the years. Now, and there absolutely are cases where conservatives get in trouble, for saying conservative things. But there oftentimes is a twist. This is John McAdams at Marquette University. He was a professor who ran a blog basically saying Marquette University, a nominally Catholic school, is not very Catholic, that it's actually more likely that you would get in trouble for saying pro-Catholic things and anti-Catholic things. And so he was not surprised, particularly when a student came to him and said, I've taped a professor in training saying in this debate class, we cannot debate gay marriage at Marquette University because to take the other side would be homophobic and offensive. Now, meanwhile, the Catholic position is opposing gay marriage. And so he wrote about this, saying, like, this is exactly what I'm talking about. Like, actually trying to take a Catholic position at a Catholic school, you're going to be told you can't. And this led to outrage because it got to the sort of like Fox News sphere. And this led to lots of nasty emails to the junior professor. And in response to that, now he didn't, he put a factually accurate blog on his blog. It wasn't even for him, it was pretty tame. And because the professor got such serious blowback, they ended up firing Professor McAdams. And again, for posting something that was absolutely factually true, they fired him. And it took a couple of years and a lawsuit, but now he's actually back at Marquette University. Now, like I said, does this look more like the classic a story of political correctness run amok? Yeah, it does. And these cases absolutely happen. But it is kind of interesting that it ends up being a case in which it's at a Catholic school. And in this case, the guy was actually, arguing about his right to be more Catholic. So I think the reason why you're seeing a lot more of this in the news, though, is the more pronounced recent trend of what we call student illiberalism. All that means is a major shift that we saw happen around 2013, 2014, was that whereas it used to be the case that when I was dealing with free speech on campus, the constituency who was the most pro-free speech, who got it the best, was always the students. The students were always the best on it. They were rock solid. They got it better than the administrators. They got it better than the faculty in a lot of different cases. And when professors would get in trouble, the people that they could sometimes at least count on to come to their side was actually their students. And that's why when you had this shift in 2013, 2014, where we started seeing, students demanding people be disinvited because they didn't like what they had said in previous situations, that they were in some cases demanding new speech codes, was really came as a surprise to me. This is kind of right towards the start of that. This is another case of a display protesting Roe v. Wade, this time at Dartmouth College. The reason why I just have to use this, though, is because the story is just ridiculous. We've seen a lot of those displays destroyed over the years, and in this case, what made this remarkable was this wasn't just destroyed, it was run over by someone's car, and it was made all the more ironic by the student who ran over this. His bumper sticker had "coexist" on the back, and it's just like, guys, come on, there's some cognitive dissonance here, and of course, just insanely dangerous. But definitely, so we started seeing this around 2013, 2014, and it seemed to happen seemingly overnight. That you started seeing students kind of coming out, and in some cases actually shouting down speakers and that kind of stuff at a scale I just hadn't previously seen. The worst culmination of it were the UC Berkeley riots. We spent a fair amount of time talking about this and coddling the American mind because they were a lot worse than I thought. They're really lucky nobody got killed during these riots. And they were in response to Milo Yiannopoulos, who, it doesn't really matter to me how much people like him or not, but he was someone whose whole job was to provoke people. He was trying to, as he would put it, trigger people. And usually the response to a speech by someone who's going to be at your school that you're not required to go to is to either not go to the speech or maybe protest outside. But a full-scale riot is something that I just hadn't seen before. This included hitting people in the head with a flagpole. In this case, this poor girl who's being maced right here, she's being maced on live TV, by the way. And she had just finished she's not wearing a Trump hat, by the way. Her hat says "Make Bitcoin Great Again." It's a nerd joke. And she had just finished saying she's really supportive of the nonviolent protesters, but not of the violent protesters, and she's immediately maced in the face. It was a much worse situation than I thought, and really shocking. Also, considering some of the people who were assaulted were just journalists who were trying to cover the Berkeley riots. But in the course of reporting for this for the book, we realized how much worse it was than we thought. And this is probably the biggest case of this spring that I've seen. This involves a case, his name is of a professor at Sarah Lawrence College, one of the most expensive colleges in the country, by the way. It's usually it's number one all the time in terms of most expensive colleges. And Sam Abrams teaches there, and he wrote an article in the New York Times saying that, yes, people say that all data indicates that faculty on most campuses lean decidedly to the left. This is not controversial in terms of statistics anymore. People don't really debate it all that much because it's kind of overwhelming. But he said that from his research, it indicates that administrators, the non-teaching part of universities, are probably lean even more so and even more monolithic. Now, what data I'd seen before that, I thought this was completely uncontroversial. I thought this was pretty well established, but Sam had gone a little bit deeper than most and found that it was Seemed to be the case at most colleges. So New York Times op-ed, not a bomb-throwing thing. It was a presentation of statistics. And this led to a takeover of the president's office. This led to student sit-ins demanding that the professor be fired. This led to, and actually the initial reaction of the university president, at least according to the professor, was saying like, maybe you should consider getting a job someplace else. And it's like, wait, hold on. So again, probably a factually accurate article, at least done scholarly in a mainstream publication is enough to get you kicked out of a university. We've done something, we haven't taught students correctly on what academic freedom means, what freedom of speech means, all that kind of stuff. You should be allowed to write and publish on controversial stuff without reaching your job, but let alone this is, and this is still ongoing. Fortunately, the president finally did say to Sam Abrams that firing him is not on the table at the moment. But yeah, these are some of the things that they wrote on his door. But then, of course, there's the ones that don't follow the situations that don't follow the stereotypes at all of what's actually going on campus. And these are the most recent trend I've seen are cases where liberal professors are getting in trouble. Now, I've seen liberal professors get in trouble my entire career, but a lot of times it's not necessarily ideological. It's for kind of like you saw in the CSU case, in the Chicago State University case. But in this case, it's very direct. And this is Professor Lisa Durden. She went on Tucker Carlson's show, probably not the best call, to defend a party that she did not attend at a school that she did not teach. A Black Lives Matter party where it was black students only were asked to attend. And again, she didn't attend it. She didn't even teach at that particular school. She went on Tucker Carlson to more or less like defend it and make fun of Tucker Carlson for it. And she got fired from her university because they were afraid of the massive conservative ugly backlash that they were expecting. Now, there were some nasty tweets, but when we did a Freedom of Information Act to figure out like how overwhelming was this, did this thing that they were so afraid of that they had to fire the professor, how big it was, apparently they received one really angry letter, and then it was mostly just otherwise phone calls and tweets. But again, the First Amendment means nothing, and particularly means nothing at a university if you can't be, in this case, mildly controversial or go on TV and argue with Tucker Carlson. And I always like to point out this case because she's one of the only professors in the whole book who got just flat out fired. It wasn't a settlement, she didn't get some kind of severance package, she just got fired from her job, and she's still fired from her job. Does this get any attention? No, and it's been kind of perplexing and interesting to me, given like the facts of it are so sort of like salacious. Now, this is Jim Livingston at Rutgers. He's a professor who complained in pretty livid terms about white gentrification of Harlem on his Facebook page. He was apparently conservative students felt like they were discriminated against by having him still be a professor at Rutgers. This led to an investigation. Again, extremely clear-cut when it comes to freedom of speech. He has the right to complain about gentrification, about an issue of public concern. And with a little bit of public pressure, Rutgers decided to shelve the complaints against him. That was just this summer. But this is one of the important things I like to emphasize, is that all of this stuff is happening at the same time. It's not as if one of these trends started and then stopped and the next one picked up. Right now I deal with cases that involve administrators, federal regulation, that involve student illiberalism, that involve conservative outrage mobs. All of these things are happening at once. So it puts me in a position where I really don't envy the situation professors are in, because it was already the case that you could get in trouble from the PR department, that if you said something that didn't make the school look good. That's always been the case. It's also always been the case that you could get in trouble from the lawyers at the university saying, "Oh my God, you're going to get sued for this." But now you add to that, you have to sort of be careful of the least tolerant student in your class and the least tolerant person on Twitter, in case, and that's a pretty low bar. So definitely things have sort of heated up for what we do, because it seems to be coming from all around at the moment. And to see a good example of this, I'm not going to explain this whole case, but the Brett Weinstein case at Evergreen State University has all of these elements all happening at the same time. We cover it in the book, and I can't really do it justice right here. So, as I get closer to the end, I just wanted to talk about what we were talking about in the book, Coddling the American Mind. I do like to say I actually objected strongly to the title, both when it was the title of the article in 2015 and when it was the title of the book that we came out in 2018. I wanted it to be called Disempowered because I think it's actually what we're doing is we're not doing a good service to students, and that we're actually, what we predicted back in 2015, an article that I wanted to boringly name Arguing Towards Misery, but that better explained what I was saying, was that the argument we made back then was that in addition to teaching students bad lessons about freedom of speech, we were teaching them bad lessons that were the intellectual habits of anxious and depressed people. That comes from cognitive behavioral therapy, but essentially if you tell them that they're always in danger, that things have never been worse, that all of these kind of what are called cognitive distortions, you shouldn't be surprised that anxiety and depression goes up. And we predicted this back in 2015, and then it turned out it was much worse than we thought. Now, these are the cognitive distortions I'm talking about. Mind reading, catastrophizing, labeling, discounting positives. As you've probably seen from some of the cases I've talked about already, there's a lot of catastrophizing going on, for example. That if, God forbid, we didn't limit people to a tiny little gazebo, I guess at Texas Tech they thought all hell would break loose or something. And that's frankly ridiculous. And that I felt like we were teaching a generation that all of these things that you're taught not to do if you want to actually recover from anxiety and depression. So that was kind of the one sort of interesting take from the original article. So I wanted to call the book Disempowered. Came out in 2018. And while we were doing the research for the book, we actually didn't initially want to write a book. We thought the article said everything we wanted to say. But then the situation got so much worse, both for free speech and mental health, that we realized we had to write a book about it. And Jonathan Haidt is my co-author. He's a famous social psychologist. He wrote a great book called The Righteous Mind, also The Happiness Hypothesis that I recommend to pretty much everybody. And as I said, things just got a lot worse. So in 2012, right around the time we noticed a change in the students, this is when depression rates for boys and women start really skyrocketing up. So something's going on. There's something important about around that time. Primary concerns among college students, anxiety and depression way up, also right around that time. And of course there are people who are saying, maybe that's actually just people are more comfortable with reporting it. Now, if you see the same thing popping up in 8 different studies, and you're kind of like, I don't think this is just self-reports we're talking about, but okay. But the thing that makes us really confident that isn't just something to do with people being more comfortable with reporting, and I honestly don't think there was that big of a change between 2012 and now anyway, but is unfortunately that the suicide rate has gone up just in lockstep with the depression, self-reports of depression, self-reports of anxiety. The suicide rate for girls in particular has doubled since 2008. And the book is trying to get to the bottom of how the interrelationship between the things we do about free speech on campus and the attitudes and about how we think this relates to poor mental health. And like I said, we were expecting things to get worse. We just weren't expecting it to get quite this worse. The suicide rate for men hasn't gone up as much. This is one of the reasons why we think that some of this has to do with, it's a famous, favorite thing to beat on, but social media, and I could definitely happy to explain why we think that that's one of the factors, but we talk about 6 different distinct factors in the book. So even though that doesn't look bad, it's actually up 25% since 2005, 2010. We should probably rescale that graph so it doesn't look so modest, because 25% is bad. So before I get to questions, I always like to give metaphorical homework, and that just includes IUP is a yellow light school. We'd be happy to work with you to change to a green light. Now, going from green to yellow for a lot of cases, for a lot of schools, can be as simple as just slightly rewording a couple policies. Adopting the Chicago Statement. This is a statement of academic freedom and free speech developed by the University of Chicago. I think it's really inspiring. I think it's worth everybody reading. Teach students about academic freedom and free speech during freshman orientation. This has been the thing I've really been on about the most lately, is that there's a lot of sort of making fun of students for not understanding some of the aspects of freedom of speech and academic freedom and due process. But my question is, has anybody ever taught them anything about this? I didn't do like an academic explanation of this, but actually a lot of these concepts are difficult. They're not even necessarily intuitive if you've never actually been taught them before. And I think that the first school who develops a really powerful orientation program on freedom of speech will see that a lot of these problems don't start in the first place. Definitely I would love it if you checked out my book with Jonathan Haidt. And I always ask people to do some tougher work, which is be prepared to fight for your own freedom of speech and, more importantly, the free speech of others, and make it a lifelong habit to seek out smart people with whom you disagree. As far as things that if I could wave a magic wand, that would be the thing that I would probably want everybody to start doing. I think we desperately need it for the sake of, our country, our community, everything, our universities. It's a great habit to have. You learn a lot if you really do think of it. If you're always kind of suspicious of your own confirmation bias and are always saying, it's like, why would anybody disagree with me on this? Why don't I go talk to someone who does? And I think we could make a lot of progress with that. And this is a great quote from the FIRE founder: "A nation that does not educate in liberty will not long endure in liberty and will not even know when it's lost." I think we have been seeing sort of a chipping away of our civil liberties for quite some time, and I think we're not even aware of how different it is even from just a couple decades ago. So here's my contact information, and I'm happy to take questions.